Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's podcast on cybersecurity. I have with me Antoinette King, founder of Credo Consulting. Antoinette has 21 years of experience in the security industry. With 21 years of experience, Antoinette founded Credo Consulting in 2020 with the goal of providing her clients a holistic perspective of a cyber physical security program with a focus on data privacy and protection. She is an active member of ACES, holding positions as chapter chairperson of the Hudson Valley chapter, member of the Women in Security Global Council, co-chair of the WIS Publications Committee, and member of the Strategic Alliance Committee. Thank you for joining, and how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you. So one of the questions I always like to start with is to share about the career path. I know you and I share a great passion for cybersecurity. And like many other professionals in the industry, we didn't start out the way. So in your own words, tell us about your career path.
Sure. So I'm one of the rare people that came into the security industry by design. I went to school for criminal justice. I have an associate's degree in criminal justice. And shortly after graduating with that degree, the school that I was going to, the State University of New York at Farmingdale, created a managing security systems program. So I graduated with that degree. And after I graduated, the chairperson had suggested that I get some computer background because back in the late 90s, he had the foresight to know that there was going to be some sort of convergence between, back then we called it IP, right? And now it's IT, but we called it IP, and security. And so that was that first phase of transition from analog to network-based systems, right? Very basic. And so I spent 17 years in the integration space. I was a technician for the first few years of my career, building systems, programming, mounting cameras. So this was all basically on the physical security side of things. And then through the 17 years, worked as operations manager. So I understood the back end side of working within the industry, and then ultimately ended up at Access Communications for the last 4 years. I was there working on manufacturing side of things. And then finally decided to go out on my own. While I was with Access, actually, about 3.5 years ago, I recognized in the physical security industry that there was a big chasm of knowledge between networking and then InfoSec, right? And how to secure endpoint devices. And we really started settling into that whole notion of IoT. And so I went back to school and got my master's degree in cybersecurity policy and risk analysis because I wanted to be more educated on the threat landscape and how to mitigate these threats. And once you start scratching the surface of cybersecurity, it's things you see you can't unsee. And that's where my passion for security just ignited even more. It was kind of the gasoline on the fire, because I truly started to understand that the cyber threat landscape transcends all verticals. So it's not just something that's specific to the IT department or specific to technology companies, but it really does transcend all verticals. And so then it became for me more of, I started becoming an evangelist for cyber hygiene and IoT endpoint device security, because it's a matter of national security. The more devices that we put on our networks, the more vulnerable we as a nation are, right? And so that's kind of how I ended up falling into this. And then I founded my consulting firm because I have this unique opportunity to bridge the gap between domains. So much experience in physical security and now knowledge base and understanding of cybersecurity. And I'm able to kind of speak both languages. And my goal is to be able to demystify cybersecurity for people in the physical security industry so that we can service as a holistic security posture versus having just physical security people doing physical security and then InfoSec doing the cyber stuff. There needs to really be a better, and I know we'll get to this later, but there needs to be a better synergy between the domains.
True, and that's why like a merger of cyber and physical security, and especially when it comes to buildings. Yes. So today's discussion is about cyber physical security in buildings. So as we all know, and it's the same across all the industries, connected systems, and they are becoming the prime targets for cyber attacks. Hackers are quicker than the security leaders and the experts to recognize the blind spots when it comes to IT and especially OT and IoT environment, because they rely a lot on third-party providers and outsourced systems. And one of the things that Gartner said that by 2023, the financial impact of cyber physical system attacks as a result of fatal casualties will reach over $50 billion, which is 10 times higher than 2013 level of data security breaches, which is like huge.
Yeah.
And especially if we talk about billings, and you know this, there are siloed systems, independent vendors coming in and doing their own stuff on the systems. There are security gaps in the systems, and now these days providing remote access. So what are the emerging threats and trends driving the new approach to security?
All right. So from an emerging threats standpoint, the biggest issue that I see for OT and IoT devices is most of the products are being developed with the notion of first to market. And so they kind of get a product out there and then manage all of the vulnerabilities and risks and bugs, if you will. That's what they used to call it, bugs. They work out the bugs later. And so this latest and greatest technology, you know, everybody gets drawn in by the flashy kind of, oh, look what we can do device. But they really are not being designed with security in mind. So that first to market is, to me, an emerging threat before anything else, because we're providing products that are not secure by design. So rather than taking the time to have the products vulnerability scanned and pen tested prior to going to market, it's kind of being done afterwards. And at that point, it's too late because it's already a vulnerability, right? So that's the first thing. I believe, as you said, supply chain is a big deal, right? Everything that we do when it comes to OT is third party. The building owner is not building systems on their own. They're not creating HVAC systems, and they're not creating lighting systems from scratch. They're relying on third parties. So we've got vulnerabilities that are created within the physical devices. But then we have a huge knowledge gap, and this is something that I like to work with in the channel, the people doing the implementation and the installation of these devices. With all due respect for the people that work in HVAC and the people that work in lighting and security, physical security, for generations, everything's been analog and literally air gapped because it's analog. There's no need to worry about things like firmware, right? In those environments. When I started in this industry and cameras were connected by coaxial cable, we didn't upgrade firmware unless there was something wrong with the product. It's like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. That mentality has come through each generation and is still a very strong thought process in the physical security industry. Well, the camera's working fine. I don't need to upgrade firmware. And what they fail to understand is, in this IoT environment, that firmware update could be a critical vulnerability update, right? Something being patched. And so because of these siloed communications, these systems are being built as kind of shadow IT. HVAC is doing their own thing, lighting is doing their own thing, you know, physical security people are doing their own thing. And very rarely do we bring in the people who are managing the networks. From a physical security standpoint, I always share this story, and I'm guilty of it. So I'll be the first one to admit it. Our answer in physical security to securing the network is managing our own segment, doing some micro segmentation. Air gapping is like the answer to everything. And what people don't understand, as I'm sure you're very well aware, that's not the answer, right? And it's very easy to jump the air gap, especially with internal threats. And so we would just build our own network and say, we don't want to deal with IT because they were the roadblock. And so that's another emerging threat. This siloed communication is just going to continue until we create environments where there's synergy and there's, everybody's talking. Another emerging threat is the lack of talent that we have in the industries, all of the industries, when it comes to endpoint security and networking. Right now, the IT industry is light years ahead of IoT and OT technology because they've been working it for so long. And so understanding how to secure networks and how to create proper password policies and how to, to manage authentication, verification, authorization. There's very huge lack of talent in that side of things when it comes to OT and IoT technology. And then, of course, we have our nation state threats that are hitting the supply chain, because supply chain truly is the soft underbelly of our nation, right? And can, of all nations, especially when it comes to buildings that are involved with critical infrastructure, data centers, and office buildings that house high profile people. So I think it's really, really important to take this seriously and to understand that there needs to be a more cohesive communication between the people that are doing the OT, IoT stuff and the people that are managing the networks.
True. And like you correctly said, these days, these IoT devices and PropTech solutions coming up, in a hurry to launch the product, they lack security. And this is what we always say, security by design approach. And we have seen the other side, like real estate, reaching out to these PropTech companies and then doing a pilot, putting these technologies and devices, the solution in the building. So one of the things we often suggest is go for a vendor risk assessment, like how we do in IT before putting a solution, so that at least you know what they risk and you know how to mitigate their risk. And as you said, the other thing, lighting system doing their own stuff, HVAC doing their own stuff. So, and this is what we commonly see in buildings. Like there are very few buildings that follow the integrated approach, but not all in terms of managed services, especially when it comes to security. So how to integrate third-party providers' technology and outsourced system into your attack surface management strategy? Because when you come up with a strategy, or you, let's say you go for an assessment and you know the risk and vulnerabilities at the current state when the assessment is done, but then how to bring in the new technology or retrofit or integrating any third-party technology, and then at the same time manage the attack surface strategy.
Sure. So especially when it comes to real estate, there's this race for smart buildings, right? So the real estate industry, I'm going to use the word under attack, but I don't really mean under attack, but like are under attack from the technology manufacturers because they want to get their technologies in the buildings. And then from the flip side, the building managers and property managers want to make smart buildings because that's attractive to their tenants, right? Okay, so now we've got this kind of very serendipitous environment where it's like we want to rush to get technology in, but we also want to make sure that it's secure. So this is a real problem, and I think it's something that is manageable, but you have to have processes involved. So the first way that you're going to be able to really truly successfully integrate third-party products into your risk map is by incorporating all stakeholders into the security culture. The only way that you are going to really truly as an organization thoroughly be able to understand where your threats and your vulnerabilities are is that you have stakeholders from all departments involved in the security decisions that are being made within the organization. So people that are responsible for facilities, HVAC and lighting, and the people that are responsible for, for renting out the spaces, all of those people, there needs to be representation from all of those different departments when it comes to this really mapping out the security goals for the organization. Depending on the technology and where it's going to be on the network and what the role of that technology is, will then determine what kind of mitigations and controls that you need in place. So how will that technology affect the assets within your building? So taking a step backwards, in this map, you need to define your assets, you need to categorize them, and then you need to determine how much protection you need around those assets. So if you're doing the proper vendor risk assessment and you've categorized the risk and then you've matched it up with the asset, you're going to determine, like, is this risk acceptable for this asset? And then you can engage in that technology, or you cannot engage in that technology, or you can pick that vendor, or you can look for a new vendor. So it really it's all intertwined, right? Understanding your assets, categorizing your assets, understanding how data flows on your network, being able to determine who has access to things and who doesn't, and then what does that technology need to have access to in order to function properly, and what assets reside on that part of the network. If we're maintaining, if it's a card access system, for example, and all of the tenants are going to have some sort of PII, that it's connected with the credential, then you need to protect that differently than if it's smart lighting, that you're going to be using Bluetooth with, and only a certain number of people are going to be able to have access to it. So, and then also as part of your, your risk map and your threat assessment, you need to make sure that there's a policy in place on how to keep those things up to date. It was really interesting and a little bit off topic, but I got an email yesterday from Zoom indicating that if you're going to be using the Zoom platform, there is, I believe it's a 9-month, is it a 9-month protocol? Like you can't be a certain number of versions behind. It just won't work, right? So in order to use the platform, you have to be at 5.5 to start, and then it'll stop being available to use unless you're at a certain, at a certain version. Having policies in place like that will not allow people to put stuff on a network unless it's up to date. There's some sort of maintenance system involved. That's going to shrink that attack surface, but it has to be something that's a thread in your culture of your organization.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you on this, because identify the asset, understand the risk, and understand the impact of that risk on that asset and the other assets in the network. Because what we have commonly seen, and this is a myth, that every asset needs the same level of security. Like as you said, depending on what the asset is, the level of security and the level of protection you need is different. So this is how, so it's really important to understand.
The janitor's closet with the supplies doesn't need the same security as your data center, right? Like we're not going to secure this pen with $10,000 worth of technology. It's not necessary. You can replace it. And I think that's where we get fear, uncertainty, and doubt in this industry, because everybody thinks, oh, it's going to cost me so much money. Yeah. And that's not in fact the case. We just need to know where are the important assets, and then we'll build out from there.
Yes. Because one of the questions we often get asked is, do you do a 24/7 monitoring? And the counter question we always ask is, do you know you actually need this, or it's just something you have heard and you want it?
Right.
So now coming to defining the strategy. So you have to think about a lot of elements that combine to form a cyber physical system. And there are so many things we hear, like balance between security and convenience. And these days, utilizing cloud platform to manage the systems, and the term single pane of glass. So what should your comprehensive strategy in terms of cyber physical security should look like for a building?
Well, the first thing is you need to understand the objectives of the organization, right? So once we've defined what the organization's objectives is, even if, real estate, it could be different from one facility to the next, right? One can be, multi-tenant dwelling with mixed, residential and commercial. One could be just commercial. So once we've defined what the goals of the organization are, physical security, cyber security should be, I use this analogy all the time and I will continue to use it, rather than being roadblocks, they should be the guide rails by which all business decisions are made, right? And you're 100% right. There has to be a balance between security and ease of use. Because if you implement the most stringent security policies and you've got all the controls in place, but it's inconvenient, what's going to happen is people are going to find ways to completely circumvent those controls. And so they mean nothing. And that's where you have people that tailgate and you don't know who's in your facility because it's like 13 steps to get into something, or they're just going to use a USB drive rather than using, the cloud solution because they have to do 37 steps to get to the cloud solution. So a comprehensive enterprise security strategy is going to be custom to every organization, but it's going to look at the business objectives. It's going to determine what the most important priorities are in terms of assets. It's going to protect those assets with multiple layers that are done in such a way that it will allow it will be in a business enabler versus a business roadblock. And it's hard. It's not an easy thing to do. However, if you include stakeholders, like we said before, from all departments, and everybody's on board with why we're doing this, establish the why, which is super important because, believe it or not, as technical as all of this stuff is, there is a psychological piece to it. that if people feel invested in it and they understand why you're doing something, they're going to be more likely to follow along. And it can't just be, you know, when we talk about training and the tail end of the strategy, when we talk about internal training for assets, it can't just be a once a year, go through a video training, click a couple of boxes, and then move on, right? Because that's not effective. It's as a matter of fact, it's a waste of money. It needs to be ingrained in the organization as part of its culture. And if you have a culture of security, people are going to be more likely to think twice about implementing technologies on their own, not including the, you know, InfoSec and IT people, because that is two different departments, by the way. People don't know that. They think IT is InfoSec and it's not, right? Now, being on the flip side, I understand why IT people would get their back and their guard up when we try to implement new technologies, because they weren't invited in the conversation from day one. They weren't invested in what we were trying to do. So by keeping them at arm's length, it was an us against them mentality. So the strategy has to be inclusive, and it has to make sure that everybody's invested, because when everybody's invested, you're going to be more successful.
True. And to your point, get the answer why we are doing this, because what we have seen is a lot of focus in how to do it rather than why we are doing it. And as threats evolve, and business resiliency is a critical initiative, especially when it comes to OT. So it's really important to have a holistic physical and cybersecurity vision.
100%.
So thank you for sharing your insights. And
it's my pleasure
to have you. And I do look forward to see you in person someday.
Yes, hopefully. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.